What we're going to take a look at is looking at some information from Kansas and then also the broader U.S. The first slide here basically gives you a little bit of an indication of where we are now, at least from a real estate perspective, compared to where we were in the last crisis. What I have here is the inflation-adjusted land values, and you can see that the peak in 1980 was roughly 15. In 2015, we're up above 2,000, and so just looking at this, essentially in Kansas, we're 33% higher in terms of where we are with the peak compared to where we were in the previous farm crisis. If you look at these numbers from different states, you're going to see differences, but essentially I think the main thing to draw about this is that in inflation-adjusted terms, the land values that we're seeing now are quite a bit higher than they were in the previous peak. And looking at what's going to happen in the future is going to be very important in terms of where we end up in this downturn, in terms of whether or not the downturn is pretty much over and we'll go back to being a normal profitability sector, or whether or not there may be more severity. And so land values are going to be key. One of the things that we've done at Kansas State is we end up doing a national survey, and again, it's important to realize that this is broader than Kansas. This is a national survey of agricultural lenders. And we essentially use the University of Michigan process that they use for their consumer sentiment survey, where we ask lenders, over the last 3 months, have your land values increased? Have your land values stayed the same? Have they ended up decreasing? We then end up taking those numbers from each return survey, and if everybody thinks they've went up, the index would be 200. If everybody thinks they went down, the index would be 0. And if roughly the same number that think they went up as they went down, the number would be 100. This survey is done in September. In March, we're just getting ready to do our March 2016 or spring 2016 survey. One of the things you can end up seeing, at least lenders nationwide did indicate that they're beginning to see decreasing land values. It was first documented in spring of 2015, and then if you look at the fall 2015 numbers, you'll see that there's a substantially more negative sentiment out there, that land values actually are lower than they were 3 months ago. If you look at what happens, or what the expectations are over the next year, basically the short-term 1-year period, you can see that, again, the sentiment started going negative in 2014, and that has continued to, again, be more negative in the fall of 2015. If you look at the 2 to 5 years, basically there is sentiment that land values in 2 to 5 years will be lower than they were at the end of 2015. And so overall, there is some sentiment out there that land values will be decreasing in the future. The question is how much, and in some respects that's going to be done by looking at the net cash and net farm income numbers. Again, these are the numbers that Jeff talked about. Again, you can see that they have come off quite a bit by the high, but probably what I want you to look more at is just where we are in terms of the forecast for 2015 and 2016 in terms of the net farm income for the sector. If you go all the way back, essentially you're looking at net farm income numbers of 2003, 2002, 2001, a little bit maybe in terms of 2006, and that's going to be pretty important in terms of looking at that, where the net farm income of the sector is at 60 billion nominal dollars. I think the other thing that is really going to drive where we end up, and Jeff alluded to this a little bit, is just where we're going to go with regards to production costs. We end up keeping enterprise budgets for a number of the farm producers in Kansas, and we end up having over time a pretty nice series that looks at what the variable cost is per acre and what the total cost is. And I'm displaying these numbers for corn and soybeans, but if you look back into the 2008, 2009, 2010 period, the variable cost of corn was running about 265, 267, 268 per acre. If you look at what it was in 2014, essentially we were about $55, $60 higher. In terms of the total cost, again, you're seeing about a $70 difference. If you look at soybeans for those same periods of time, you see roughly a $50 difference in terms of variable production costs. And then if you look at the total cost, you're up at about 70. And so the key thing to remember here is if we go back to commodity prices in 2007, 2008, 2009, we're working at a higher cost of production level, and so that is going to be pretty important in terms of just what producers are going to be able to do with those costs. Certainly the total cost is going to include some of the land costs. The variable costs are things like fertilizer, seed, fuel, those types of things that many times are going to be outside the producer's control other than the amount that they end up using. The other thing I think that's really important to consider as we move forward is just where we are in terms of the risk that farmers are managing. What I have here is essentially just some rough numbers to give you an indication of using 150 bushel average coverage of 80%. That would guarantee you 120 bushel, and so I'm assuming that that's going to be the same from 2013 to 2016. If you look at the base price, in 2013 farmers were able to guarantee a base price of $565. That dropped to $462 in 2014. In 2015 it dropped to $415. The number in 2016 is an estimate based upon February. We're kind of in the window now with regards to setting that price, and it's going to be an average of the December 2016 price that occurs in February. And using a rough estimate, I'm looking at maybe 383, but looking at that, you see that the amount of revenue that a producer was able to lock in under these situations was $678 per acre in 2013. You're looking at about $460 per acre in 2016. And so they're essentially managing 32% more risk in 2016 than they were just 4 years ago. We look at the same example in terms of soybeans, same type of analysis. Again, it's also down 32%. If you look at hard red wheat, that's down 43%. The only difference here is that the 496 is locked in. That is set in the fall of the year. And so there is a lot more risk that farmers are managing with regards to their production enterprises. And so not only, for example, are they working with higher costs, they're also dealing with managing a higher risk simply because of the decline in the price of commodity over this period of time. One of the things that people always ask is how are we comparing to where we were in 1979? What I've done here is essentially estimate a default risk model, kind of using information both from Kansas farmers in 1979 and then also in 2014, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what's going on with regards to those. Again, the distribution here in 1979 is probably not a lot different than what we are at the end of 2014. One of the things you'll see is that the green distribution is a little bit further to the left in terms of a little bit higher quality type operations. If you look more to the right, you also see that the purple numbers or basic bars are a little bit higher. And so overall, we're a little bit safer than we were in 1979. But it wasn't substantially different. And why I use 1979 is if we go forward, essentially that was just 2 years before we were in 1981. And just looking at what happened from 1979 to 1981, you'll see that that distribution shifted substantially to the right. In terms of thinking about this, repayment capacity is really critical, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about. But if we look at what happened during the last farm crisis, that repayment capacity fell from 152.8 to 16.3% in 2 years. And so 100% basically means that farmers have enough income or enough revenue in order to pay off all of their expenses, their family living, their taxes. They're able to pay their principal and interest. And so 100 is really the key. And so being above 100 means that you have more than enough cash to pay all of your expenses. Being below 100 means that adjustments need to be made in order to pay all your expenses. There were really two key factors that drove that thing to move from 152.8 to 16.3. The first one is an increase in interest payments by 65%, and then essentially a decline in farm production by 15.7%. And so land values could no longer be supported, and one of the things that people are really considering is where are we now and are we headed for a potential crisis again? What I've done here is essentially at the end of the years for 2011, 2012, 2013, and 14, we took an average repayment capacity ratio. You'll see that in 2011 it was 149.39, not a whole lot different than it was in 1979. And then that has steadily eroded in 2012, 13, and 14. And in 2014, the average capital repayment capacity ratio fell below 100%. What this means is that in 2014, these producers were not able to make all of their expenses with the income generating potential. And so this is looking at the ability to repay debt from a return perspective and income perspective. We can also look at it just from more of a debt-to-asset perspective, and the debt-to-asset perspective is probably quite a bit better, except if you look at what's happened in the last 2 years. In Kansas, we were increasing debt at a fairly slow rate from 2005 to 2012. We increased it roughly by $109,000. However, if you look at the last 2 years, 2012 to 2013, 2013 to 2014, each year we roughly increased debt by $47,000. And so we're beginning to see a run-up in debt on these operations, essentially $95,000 in the last 2 years, which is fairly similar to what we had done the previous 8 years. What's also more interesting is just where that debt is accumulating. Long-term debt increased 17% of that $47,000 in 2013. The intermediate was $23,000. The current was 60%. Long-term debt is going to be used to finance real estate. Intermediate debt is going to be used to finance machinery and equipment, some breeding livestock. Current is going to be used to look at operating expenses. And so of that $47,000, 60% of that was done and accumulated in 2013. A couple reasons why that will occur. One is they're unable to pay off all of their current debt from crop operating. The other aspect is sometimes farmers will end up financing their inventory to essentially allow them to market their crop in the following year. Looking at that, that was a pretty good strategy in 2013 in that the market did bounce back. But if we look at where we were at the end of 2014, we've even moved more towards the current side. Couple things to indicate: most of the current debt is going to be at a variable rate, and so the intermediate and long-term debt many times is going to be at a fixed rate. And so looking at that, we're taking on debt in a place that's more variable. We're also taking on debt that in some respects is a little bit more disturbing to manage than the intermediate and long-term debt. Thinking longer term, we're looking at this with regards to the prices Kansas farmers received. From 2003 through 2014, their actual numbers. For 2015, 16, 17, and 18, their projected numbers. What I've done here is just use the Chicago futures prices for the harvest price, and then I end up subtracting an average basis. Looking at that, if you look at 2016, 17, and 18 for soybeans, you're looking at about $8.20, $8.30 per price. If you're looking at corn, you're looking right at about $4. Again, if you pull that number back, you can see that we're looking at corn price in about 2007, 2008, 2009, about the same with regards to soybean prices. And so the key is we're going to have prices that we've received, if the markets are correct, similar to what we received in 2007, 8, and 9. But if you remember back to that enterprise graph, enterprise cost, you can see that our costs are quite a bit higher, and so we won't get the same response. This last graph here looks at what does that do to crop income. And so we've plotted out what is the income per crop acre, and you'll end up seeing that projecting forward, we're looking at $52, $53 per acre. And again, if you pull that back, that's kind of the same level of income we were seeing in 2007, 2008, 2009. So what does that do to future land prices? Looking at this, we can end up using regression from 1973 through 2014. We estimated that the long-run multiplier, or a P ratio, is 21.7 for Kansas. This is a capitalization rate of 4.6%. If you believe that we're going to go back to a normal longer-term capitalization rate of 4.6%, at the projected net farm income of $53 per acre, that would suggest a $1,150 price for non-irrigated land in Kansas. This would essentially be a decrease of 43% from where we are previously. Certainly there's aspects here that could cause this not to be the case. We may end up choosing to accept a lower rate of return than the 4.6% that we have had historically. What that would indicate is would run at a higher PE ratio. But the other thing is perhaps we could end up seeing a bounce back in income above that $53. But certainly there is a lot of downside risk with regards to land values if we look at it from long-term historical norms. To summarize, the financial situation in the farm sector is currently in excellent shape, partially due to the crop insurance and the ability to lock in the revenue. However, it's not much different than it was in '79, a couple of years before the bust. The ability to repay debt and interest out of earnings and maintain family living was not possible for the average Kansas farm in 2014. Early information in 2015 suggests that that also could be a problem. And so farmers need to begin to think about, and they have been beginning to do this, is begin to restructure debt. They've been looking at reducing the cost structure of the farming operation. Some producers are beginning to look at adjusting their crop mix, adjusting their crop insurance levels, and adjusting their family living. One of the things also that's running out there is basically just concerns with regards to lending regulation. There is some concern with regards to how much flexibility lenders will have in working with farmers that need to restructure debt or that need to do some workouts. This is going to be especially important for those that have entered the sector in the last couple of years. And so certainly we are in a good situation moving into this downturn. The issue I think that's really out there and in the unknown is how long will this last, and what type of adjustments will be made in the sector as we move forward. And so with that, we will turn it over to Ani, who will do the last presentation.